Mike Filipov here, guitar practice expert from practiceguitarnow.com. Today we're going to talk about the role of the wrist versus the forearm when it comes to picking fast. And once you apply the things I'm going to show you in the next few minutes, I think you'll find that picking fast is going to feel a heck of a lot easier than it probably does right now. The bit of conventional wisdom I'm going to challenge here is this rule that when you're playing scales and scale sequences, you need to use your wrist to play on individual strings, and you need to use your forearm to change strings. Now, on the surface, this rule does kind of make sense and it has some validity to it, but the problem is this advice is very often misunderstood and misapplied, especially when it's taken too literally. There are two issues that I have here. First of all, if you take this advice as literally as it is often taken, and you play, let's say, a major scale by using your wrist on individual strings and using your forearm, your arm, to change strings, it's going to look something like this. And if you do that and try to play fast this way, it's going to be very, very difficult. And the problem here is the forearm. The motion of the forearm with this traditional way of thinking about picking is very much overemphasized and over-exaggerated. Think of it like this. The forearm is a much larger muscle group than the wrist, obviously. So therefore, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy to move the arm from a dead stop to get it in motion. And once it's in motion, it tends to stay in motion, and once you get to the next string, you have to stop the forearm from moving, and it takes a lot of energy and effort to do that. And if you go from a dead stop to motion, to a dead stop to motion again, on every single string, it is a lot of extra unnecessary effort that's being wasted. Here's the next problem I have with the traditional rule of using the wrist and the forearm for picking, and that is when some people change strings, they actually slide their forearm up and down the body of the guitar, so it looks something like this. Notice what happens. My shoulder becomes tense. It actually lifts up into the air, and the more tension you have in your shoulder, the harder it is to play guitar, and it's almost impossible to play guitar fast. The second issue here is when you're sliding the forearm up and down the guitar like this, that many people do, it changes the picking position for your picking hand and for your pick. And that makes it difficult to mute string noise, to keep your hands in sync, to articulate the notes correctly, creates all kinds of other problems. So here's the solution. The solution is to use your wrist a lot more to play scales and scale sequences, and only use your forearm just enough to keep the wrist from bending this way. So first, why prioritize the wrist? Well, obviously the wrist is much smaller, so it's easier to get into motion and to stop and to move quickly. But if I only use my wrist and I keep my forearm stationary, two things are going to happen. Observe. Notice, obviously you can hear a lot of string noise because by bending the wrist, it becomes impossible to mute the strings that I'm not playing. And also, by bending the wrist like this, my articulation suffers, my synchronization suffers, and we got to solve this somehow. So this is where we bring the forearm into action. And instead of doing what everybody tells you to use the forearm on every single string change, I tell people to use the forearm on every other string change. So here's what it looks like when I play a scale. I'm going to play the first three notes on the low E string using my wrist. To move to the A string using my wrist, not the forearm, wrist, because it's a short enough distance where I can just make the string change using my wrist and play the three notes on the A string using my wrist as well. So I'm going to play the first 6 notes of the scale using my wrist. It's going to look like this. One more time. Now, when it's time to go to the D string, I have to start engaging my forearm, because if I don't, my wrist is going to start to bend, and as we talked about before, we want to avoid that. So, what's the best way to make the string change using the forearm? You see this skin here? This is going to be the most important part of your forearm motion. The way I think of it is like this. I rest my arm on the body of the guitar, and I let the weight of my arm go into the body of the guitar, relaxing my whole arm. And you see how my forearm kind of rolls in every direction? It rolls as far as the skin right here is able to stretch. I'm never going to slide up and down the body of the guitar with my arm like so. Instead, you're just going to rest in a comfortable spot wherever it's comfortable for me or wherever it's comfortable for you, and the skin is going to stretch, and that's going to be a range of motion in every direction in a comfortable way. So back to the string change. I played the notes on the A string using my wrist. Now it's time to roll the forearm on its skin using a bit of motion right here. And now I'm ready to play the notes on the D string, again using the wrist. So let me play the first 9 notes of the scale as I just described. So I'm going to play the first 6 using the wrist, and then I'm going to make a very small, barely noticeable change from the A string to the D string using my forearm, and play those 3 notes on the D string using the wrist again. Observe. Then after the D string, you play the 3 notes on the D string with the wrist, and you go to the G string using the wrist as well. Play those 3 notes with the wrist. To go to the B string, to avoid the wrist from bending, you roll the forearm just a little bit more. It's barely noticeable, but you can feel it on its skin like we talked about. To play the 3 notes on the B string using the wrist, and go to the high E string using the wrist and play those 3 notes with the wrist as well. So all together, it's going to look like this. One more time. So to recap, you're using your forearm on every other string change, and you're using your wrist also on every other string change. You're balancing them using 50% wrist, 50% forearm on string changes. And to descend, to go back down this way, from the highest string to the lower strings in pitch, it's the same exact principle. You're using your forearm on every other string change, but you're using your wrist as much as possible on every string change in the middle, like this. Everything we just talked about applies the same exact way to inside picking. Now, if you don't know what inside picking is, it's where your pick goes back and forth between 2 adjacent strings, like so. If you do inside picking using the conventional logic of using the forearm and string changes, you're making it as hard as you possibly can for yourself, and way harder than necessary, because as we talked about, engaging the forearm on every string change is a bad idea, and sliding the arm up and down the guitar is also a bad idea. But if you use your wrist to go back and forth between 2 adjacent strings on inside picking, all of a sudden it feels way easier. Look. Try this out, and I think you'll be impressed with the results. This advice I just gave you applies very well to playing scales and scale sequences when you're going from the 6th string to the 1st string, but there are exceptions to it when you are doing tremolo picking on one string, or when you're playing 1 string licks like this. The roll of the forearm and the roll of the wrist is a little bit different on those 2 techniques, but that's going to be a topic for a future video sometime in the future. Right now, the main point I want to make is when it comes to building speed, it's really about plugging in efficiency leaks in your technique, making your motions efficient, relaxing excessive muscle tension, locking your 2 hands in tight synchronization. And also, it's about using effective practice methods that are going to allow you to cement all of that increased efficiency and your increased muscle memory, and bring all of that perfection into your faster playing. If you just focus on those 2 things, efficiency, leaks, plugging those, and bringing that perfection into your faster playing using correct practice methods, you pretty much can't go wrong. And on that note, if you want to know exactly how to practice with this increased efficiency in your picking hand to build a lot of speed in not a lot of time, I have a 1-hour masterclass on my website all about how to build guitar speed, how to practice to play faster, most importantly, how to do it without the traditional way of starting slow and gradually building up speed, which, let's face it, is pretty boring. Nobody likes to do that. Well, I have a way of how you can avoid this and build a lot of speed, even if you don't have a lot of time to practice. Hit the link in the description of this video, check it out, it's free. Just enter your email address, I'll send it right over to you. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so YouTube notifies you every time I upload new videos just like this. This is Mike Filipov, guitar practice expert from PracticeGuitarNow.com. I'll see you next time.